Most literature on HPV infection is comprised of individual-based studies. With individual-based studies, we can measure prevalence, and if participants are followed up, we can measure incidence rates. In addition to prevalence and incidence rates, couple-based studies can measure transmission rates. The Eurogen roadmap is an informal synthesis of the state of the literature. And the Eurogen 2014 roadmap suggested greater rates of female to male compared to male to female transmission. They identified 5 studies and pointed to the fact that all 5 studies had greater female to male transmission compared to male to female. However, the roadmap didn't mention how they identified these articles, and there were no formal meta-analytical procedures to assess a differential HPV transmission. So the aim of our systematic review was to assess the evidence for a differential transmission rate hypothesis in heterosexual couple-based studies considering genital-to-genital alpha HPV transmission. We worked with the librarian to develop our search strategy, and we searched these 5 databases. We conducted the initial search in June. There were no languages or year restrictions. The study selection criteria, transmission rates of alpha HPV types reported. So because it's a transmission rate, it necessarily needed to be a longitudinal study and not cross-sectional. The population included heterosexual couples age 18 years and over, so no individual-based studies, and genital samples collected from couples. The studies could collect a variety of samples, but we needed the genital sampling. We extracted numerous information on a number of variables. The first one, study features. We collected information on sample size at baseline and sample size used for analysis. Now, these two would be different because to do transmission rate analysis, we need a discordant infection within the, discordant HPV infection within the couple. So that's why, unless the study in the eligibility criteria, unless they needed a discordant infection, the two would be different. Not only did we collect information about the participants' characteristics, we also wanted to characterize the relationship, so we looked at relationship status and relationship length. For HPV detection, we looked at the genotyping method used and how many HPV types could be detected and which HPV types. Quantitative data like events in person time and type-specific HPV rates. We used the statistical software R for our meta-analysis. And for our meta-analysis, we needed to input events in person time. However, there were a couple of studies that only reported events in rate. So for this reason, we rearranged the equation to determine person time. And this allowed us to input events in person time into our statistical software. We used metaphor and meta to pull transmission rates and transmission rate differences respectively. We removed outliers to explore the impact. For HPV type preponderance, for studies that reported HPV type specific transmission rates, and for each directionality, we counted occurrences of directionality preponderance to see if there's like a favor of counts for one directionality or the other. And we summed type-specific HPV rates corresponding to HPV types in each subgenus group. For our primary screen, there were 596 titles and abstracts screened. 573 records were excluded, so they're excluded because they did not provide genital sampling. They're individual-based studies, or they're cross-sectional and not longitudinal. And then for our secondary screen, there are 23 full-text records assessed for eligibility. And in the final set of articles, there are 7 records. So for the 5 Eurogen articles, it was the Hernandez, Burchell, Mubulawa, Wittes, and Nitre. And in our search, we found 2 more studies, the Liu and Su. So had we conducted our search strategy in 2014, like the Eurogen roadmap, we would have identified the same articles. And we can see that they come from a variety of countries, the United States, Canada, China, and South Africa. And baseline and analysis sample size, I mentioned the Liu study yesterday. It's 874 couples. And then we also have studies with as few as 25 couples enrolled. For the mean length follow-up, we have 1.5 months. We have like the Sioux study, who followed the participants up for a year. And then in the Liu study, it was almost 3 years. And so there's a lot of heterogeneity even within these variables. And mean age, we have studies where mean age of in their 20s, like the Hernandez, Burchell, and the Wittes. 2 studies in the 30s, and the Liu and Sioux study, which have participants in the 40s, or mean age of being in the 40s. And even within relationship status, this varies as well. We have dating, married, separating, cohabitating, and we have dating a partner. And for the Liu and Sioux study, they're married couples. And our corresponds to not reported. So for relationship length, as I spoke about yesterday, the Burchell study, it's from our team at McGill University. We focus on couples in newly formed relationships. But the other studies that did report relationship length, they're about, the Wittes study is about 2 years, median, and then Nitre and Mubilau were over 3 years. And even instructions prior to visit. 3 studies asked participants to abstain from sexual activity before the visit. The Liu study stated that they did not give any instructions to participants. And then the Wittes study, they had more complex instructions. For visit number 2, they asked participants to have intercourse 24 hours before the visit. For the visit 3, they asked participants to abstain from sexual interaction before visit 3, and to engage in normal sexual behaviors for the remaining visits. And the heterogeneity continues with sampling. Sampling interval between visits range from 24 hours to 6 months. For HPV detection, the amount of HPV types detected range from 16 to 46 HPV types, though most of the studies detected 36 HPV types. Here's a forest plot of the individual and pooled estimates. We have the unit is transmission rate per 100 person months, and it is organized according to directionality. We have female to male and male to female. When we look at the individual studies, we see about 5 of them that are no more than 5 HPV infections per 100 person months. And then we have Hernandez and the Wittes study, and their rates tend to be a bit higher. We also have the pooled estimate, which is a random effects estimate. As I've tried to emphasize the last few slides, there's a substantial amount of heterogeneity, and there is heterogeneity with these effect estimates. So the I-squared for the female to male was 97%, and the I-squared for male to female was 89%. And so with the 2 pooled estimates, we see that female to male is higher, though there's overlap in the confidence intervals. But the better way to compare the 2 directionalities would be to look at the transmission rate difference. So to determine transmission rate difference, we took the female to male transmission rate and subtracted the male to female transmission rate. So a positive number corresponds to it would favor female to male. A negative number would favor male to female transmission, and 0 would indicate not much of no risk difference. And when we look at the individual studies again, we see that the same 5 studies, they seem to be clustered together, whereas the Hernandez and Wittes study, their point estimates, they favor female to male transmission. And we have a pooled estimate that favors female to male transmission, but when we look at the 95% confidence interval, it doesn't entirely favor female to male transmission. And again, the heterogeneity, the I-squared, is 75%, which is still high. So, we decided to remove the Hernandez and the Wittes study because they seem like outliers, though when we look at the impact, it doesn't change a whole lot, and this actually makes sense because not a whole lot of weight was assigned to these 2 studies. We have a point estimate that favors female to male transmission, and the 95% confidence interval, again, doesn't entirely favor female to male transmission, and also the heterogeneity is 75% and still high. For the HPV type-specific rates, the only study that reported transmission rates by directionality was the LEU study. So for this reason, we also looked at incidence rates. And for these analysis, we considered the incidence rates in males and females to infer directionality under the assumption that HPV transmission occurred between study partners. And the two studies that we were able to extract this information from was the Nitre study and the Mubulawa study. And one of the things we did with this information is we looked at the directionality preponderance. So I have two examples here of HPV and HPV11 and HPV16. For HPV11 in the Nitre study, we see that it is higher in men. So this is one count for that favors female-to-male transmission. And also HPV16, it is higher from the incidence rate is higher for men than women. So that's another count that favors female-to-male directionality. So this count would be 2 to 0. And then we see the same thing with the Mubulawa study, where both incidence rates are higher in men than women. So this would be two counts that would favor female-to-male transmission. So, and then when we look at the LEU study, we have HPV11, which favors female-to-male transmission with a higher transmission rate. But then for HPV16, we have a higher male-to-female transmission rate. So that would be a count of 1 to 1. So I'm not going to go through this whole table, but this is the table that we had. And we calculated the counts from for everything that was measured. And then we were left with these counts. We had, for the Nitre study, we had 16 counts that favored female-to-male transmission rate compared to 11 for male-to-female. For Mubulawa, there was 29 counts that favored female-to-male transmission compared to 6 for male-to-female. And then we had 14 for the LEU study that favored male-to-female, so that's different than the other two, compared to 6 for female-to-male transmission. So 2 favored a preponderance of female-to-male transmission, and 1 study favored a male-to-female transmission. So HPV types were aggregated based on subgenus group with the assumption of all HPV genotypes are exclusively independent from each other. For the Nitre study, all 3 rates were higher for males, so this would favor female-to-male transmission across all 3 subgenus. And then we also see the same thing for the Mubulawa study across all 3 subgenus or subgenera. However, it is different for the LEU study. For the subgenus 1 and subgenus 2, there's higher rates for the male to female, whereas with subgenus 3, there's higher transmission rate for female to male. So concluding remarks, this is the first systematic review and meta-analysis to examine genital-to-genital alpha HPV transmission dynamics between heterosexual partners. We identified 2 more studies than the Urgent 2014 roadmap, which identified 5 articles. And so there's small evidence for a differential transmission rate with higher female-to-male compared to male-female transmission. And these findings must be interpreted with caution, however, because of the presence of substantial heterogeneity. And I'll leave you with the references for the 7 studies, and thank you.